The old man had been sitting, alone on the same park bench for almost an hour when the Thanksgiving parade ended. People walked past him carrying shopping bags. Families laughed. Children ran ahead of their parents. Couples stopped to take pictures beneath the glowing holiday decorations. Nobody stopped for him. He was 78 years old, wearing an old brown coat, holding a paper bag on his lap, and staring at the empty space beside him as though he were waiting for someone who had promised to return. But no one ever did. Then a little girl in a red sweater noticed him. She tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mommy?" Her mother was busy taking a picture. "What, honey?" "That man is alone." "I know." "Why?" Her mother looked toward the bench. "I don't know, sweetheart." The little girl watched him for several seconds. Then she asked the question that adults often forget to ask. "Can we invite him?" Her mother hesitated. "Invite him where?" "To Thanksgiving." Her mother smiled gently. "Sweetheart, we don't know him." The little girl looked back at the old man. He had opened his paper bag. Inside was a single dinner roll. Nothing else. The little girl's smile disappeared. She looked at her mother again. "But he doesn't have anyone." Her mother glanced at the crowded restaurant across the street where families were gathering for Thanksgiving dinner. Then she looked at her daughter. "Stay here." The little girl shook her head. "No." She walked toward the old man. Her mother hurried after her. The little girl stopped directly in front of the bench. The old man looked up. His eyes were tired. "Hello." The little girl smiled. "Hi. Are you lost?" She shook her head. "No." "Then what can I do for you?" The little girl pointed toward the paper bag. "Is that your Thanksgiving dinner?" The old man looked down. He smiled sadly. "Yes." The girl frowned. Then she said 6 words that would change 3 lives forever. "You can sit with us." The old man stared at her. He had been alone for 347 days. He had stopped expecting invitations. He had stopped expecting phone calls. He had stopped expecting anyone to remember his name. But that little girl didn't know any of that. She only saw an old man sitting alone. And to her, that was reason enough. The old man's name was Thomas Walker. He had spent most of his life believing he knew exactly what Thanksgiving meant. Family, tradition, warm food, football on television, arguments over politics, children running through the house, someone complaining about the turkey being dry, someone else insisting the mashed potatoes needed more butter, and after dinner, everyone gathering around the table to tell stories. Thomas had once had all of it. A wife named Margaret, a son named David, a daughter named Rebecca, a little house outside Columbus, Ohio, a garage filled with tools, a backyard where his children had played baseball, a kitchen where Margaret had burned the first Thanksgiving turkey they ever cooked together. He remembered laughing so hard that year that he couldn't breathe. Margaret had thrown a dish towel at him. "Keep laughing, Thomas," she had said. "Next year you're cooking." He had laughed harder. They had been married 47 years. 47. Thomas used to joke that after that long, marriage wasn't about romance anymore. It was about knowing exactly how your spouse liked their coffee. Margaret liked 2 sugars. No cream. Thomas liked black coffee. Every morning, he made hers first, even after she got sick. Especially after she got sick. Margaret had died 3 years before that Thanksgiving. Cancer. A long, cruel illness that slowly turned the strongest woman Thomas had ever known into someone who needed help walking from the bedroom to the bathroom. He had cared for her until the end. He had held her hand in a hospital room at 4:17 in the morning. When her breathing stopped, Thomas didn't scream. He didn't cry. He simply kissed her forehead and whispered, "I'll see you at home." But there was no home after Margaret. There was only a house filled with her things. Her sweater hanging behind the bedroom door, her favorite mug in the cabinet, her recipe cards, her handwriting on grocery lists, her perfume in the bathroom, and the silence. Thomas eventually sold the house. He couldn't bear sleeping there alone. His son David lived in California. His daughter Rebecca lived in New York. Both had families. Both had careers. Both had lives that seemed to move faster every year. They called. Sometimes, they sent Christmas cards. They remembered birthdays. But distance had a way of turning love into something that lived mostly on screens. The first Thanksgiving after Margaret died, Thomas flew to California. David had invited him. Thomas remembered arriving at the airport with 2 suitcases and Margaret's old pie recipe. He had imagined the whole family sitting around the table. He had imagined his grandchildren climbing onto his lap. He had imagined feeling useful again. Instead, David was distracted. His wife was exhausted. The children were busy with video games. The turkey was ordered from a restaurant. Nobody used Margaret's recipe. Thomas told himself not to be disappointed. Then during dinner, David's wife received a phone call. She left the table. The children disappeared. David began checking his phone. Thomas looked around. And suddenly he realized he was sitting in a room full of people and still felt completely alone. He left the next morning. He didn't tell David why. He simply said, "I think I'll head home." David had nodded. "Okay, Dad." That was all. The following year, David had said they were too busy. Rebecca had planned to visit but canceled because of work. Then she had promised Christmas. Christmas came. She didn't. Thomas stopped asking. By the third Thanksgiving, he didn't expect anyone to come. So he went to the park. It was easier there. At least the emptiness was outside. The little girl in the red sweater was named Sophie Miller. She was 7 years old. She had brown hair tied into 2 messy braids and wore a red sweater covered with tiny white snowflakes. Her mother, Rachel, had spent the morning trying to keep Sophie from eating the pumpkin pie before dinner. It hadn't worked. Rachel had a husband named Mark. They had a small townhouse. They had 1 child, and they had invited Rachel's mother, her brother, his wife, and their 3 children for Thanksgiving. The plan was simple. Eat too much. Watch football. Play board games. Take pictures. Laugh. Normal family stuff. But when Rachel saw Thomas sitting alone, something inside her changed. She watched Sophie walk toward him. "Hi," Sophie said. Thomas smiled. "Hello. My name is Sophie." "Nice to meet you, Sophie. Are you waiting for somebody?" Thomas looked toward the empty walkway. "No." Sophie tilted her head. "Then why are you sitting here?" Thomas almost laughed. "Because I like the view." Sophie looked around. There wasn't much to see. A fountain. Some trees. A row of decorated shops. She looked back at him. "You're lying." Thomas laughed. "I might be." Sophie sat beside him. Rachel hurried over. "Sophie." "Mom, I invited him." Rachel smiled awkwardly. "I heard." Sophie looked at Thomas. "You can come." Thomas looked at Rachel. "Come where?" "Our house," Sophie said. Thomas's eyes widened. "Oh, sweetheart, that's very kind, but—" "No," Sophie interrupted. "You can't eat that roll for Thanksgiving." Thomas looked down at his paper bag. "You saw that?" "Yes." Sophie opened her own small backpack. She pulled out a cookie. "Here." Thomas stared at it. "What's that?" "Chocolate chip." "You're giving me your cookie?" "Yes." "Why?" Sophie shrugged. "Because you're alone." Thomas swallowed. He hadn't cried when Margaret died. He hadn't cried when he sold the house. He hadn't cried when David forgot his birthday. He hadn't cried when Rebecca canceled Christmas. But that cookie nearly broke him. He looked at Rachel. Rachel's eyes were wet. She smiled. "Come with us." Thomas shook his head. "I don't want to impose." "You won't. I don't know you." Rachel smiled. "Neither does Sophie." Sophie corrected her. "I know him." Thomas laughed. "How?" "You're Thomas." He stared at her. "You remembered my name?" "You told me." "When?" "Just now." Thomas smiled. "Fair enough." Rachel held out her hand. "Come on, Thomas." He looked at it. Then at Sophie. Then at the paper bag in his lap. Finally, he stood. "Okay." Rachel's family wasn't sure what to think. When she arrived with an elderly stranger, her brother Jason nearly dropped the turkey platter. "Mom?" Rachel's mother looked at Thomas. "Who is this?" Rachel took off her coat. "This is Thomas." Jason frowned. "Thomas who?" "Thomas." Sophie walked into the room. "He's our Thanksgiving guest." Jason looked at Rachel. You invited a stranger? Sophie answered for her. He was hungry. Nobody knew what to say. Thomas immediately raised his hands. I don't want to cause trouble. I can leave. Rachel shook her head. No. Her mother looked uncomfortable. Rachel's voice became firmer. Mom, he was sitting alone in the park. So Sophie invited him. Everyone looked at Sophie. The 7-year-old crossed her arms. You said Thanksgiving is for family. Rachel's mother nodded. Yes. Sophie looked at Thomas. He doesn't have anyone. Rachel's mother opened her mouth, then closed it. Thomas looked embarrassed. I'll just stay for a little while. Rachel smiled. Dinner is in 20 minutes. She pointed toward the living room. Make yourself comfortable. Thomas nodded. Thank you. He sat down. At first, nobody spoke to him. The television played football. Children ran through the hallway. The adults talked about work. Thomas sat quietly. He watched everything. The noise, the laughter, the chaos. It reminded him of Margaret. He smiled. Sophie sat beside him. What are you thinking about? Thomas looked at her. My wife. Where is she? Thomas took a breath. She died. Sophie looked sad. Was she nice? Thomas smiled. She was the nicest person I ever knew. What was her name? Margaret. Did she cook? Thomas laughed. She tried. Sophie giggled. Was she bad? Terrible. Thomas looked toward the kitchen. She once burned a turkey so badly that we ate pizza. Sophie laughed. That's funny. It was the best Thanksgiving we ever had. Sophie leaned closer. Why? Because nobody cared about the turkey. What did you care about? Thomas looked around the room. Being together. Sophie thought about that. Then she asked, Do you miss her? Thomas looked down. Every day. Sophie reached for his hand. Thomas froze. Nobody had held his hand in months. Sophie squeezed it. You don't have to be sad today. Thomas smiled. Thank you. Dinner began at 5:15. Everyone gathered around the table. Turkey, mashed potatoes, stuffing, green beans, cranberry sauce, sweet potatoes, dinner rolls, pumpkin pie. Thomas sat beside Sophie. Rachel sat across from him. For the first few minutes, conversation was awkward. Then Jason asked, So, Thomas, what did you do before retirement? Thomas smiled. I was a mechanic. Jason looked interested. Really? 39 years. What kind? Cars, trucks, anything with an engine. Jason laughed. I have a truck that makes a noise I can't figure out. Thomas smiled. Bring it by sometime. Jason looked surprised. You still work? No, but you could probably tell me what's wrong. Thomas laughed. Probably. The conversation changed. People began asking questions. Where had he lived? How long had he been married? How many children? How many grandchildren? Thomas answered. Then Rachel asked, Why were you alone today? The room became quiet. Thomas looked down at his plate. My wife passed away 3 years ago. Rachel nodded. I'm sorry. My son lives in California. Do you see him often? Thomas hesitated. No. My daughter lives in New York. Do you see her? Not lately. Sophie looked at him. Why? Rachel touched her daughter's arm. Sophie. No, it's okay. Thomas smiled. Sometimes people get busy. Sophie frowned. But Thanksgiving isn't busy. Several people at the table looked down. Thomas laughed softly. Sometimes it is. Sophie shook her head. If I was your daughter, I'd come. Nobody spoke. Thomas looked at his plate. His eyes filled with tears. Rachel reached for his hand. And suddenly, the Thanksgiving table became very quiet. After dinner, the children played upstairs. The adults sat in the living room. Thomas stood near the window. Rachel approached. You okay? He nodded. Better than okay. I'm glad. I haven't eaten like that in years. Rachel smiled. Sophie's right. You needed a real Thanksgiving. Thomas laughed. She has strong opinions. She does. He looked at the family photographs on the wall. You have a beautiful family. Rachel smiled. We're not perfect. No family is. Do you regret anything? Thomas looked at her. That's a dangerous question. Rachel laughed. Sorry. No. He looked at the photographs again. I regret thinking I had more time. Rachel became quiet. Thomas continued. When my children were young, I worked all the time. Why? I wanted to give them a good life. Did you? I think so. Then why regret it? Because I thought there would always be another weekend. Rachel nodded. There wasn't. There never is. He looked down. I thought I'd make up for everything after I retired. What happened? My wife got sick. Rachel didn't know what to say. Thomas smiled. I learned too late that tomorrow isn't a promise. At 10:30, Thomas prepared to leave. Rachel offered to drive him home. He hesitated. I can walk. In this weather? I'll be fine. No. Rachel grabbed her keys. I'm driving. Thomas smiled. You're stubborn. My daughter is. She learned from someone. They laughed. Sophie ran downstairs in pajamas. Are you leaving? Yes. Why? It's late. You can sleep here. Thomas looked at Rachel. Rachel smiled. We have the guest room. Thomas shook his head. I couldn't. Sophie frowned. Why not? Because I don't want to be a bother. Sophie looked at him seriously. You're not a bother. Thomas's eyes filled again. She hugged him. He stood completely still for a moment. Then he hugged her back. Thank you. Sophie whispered, Come back next Thanksgiving. Thomas closed his eyes. I will. Rachel drove Thomas home. He lived in a small apartment above a hardware store. It was clean. Almost too clean. There were very few decorations. No family photographs. No Christmas lights. No clutter. Rachel noticed. You don't have many things. Thomas smiled. I got rid of most of it. Why? Too many memories. She understood. At the door, Thomas turned. Thank you. Rachel smiled. Thanks, Sophie. I will. He walked inside. Rachel waited until the light came on. Then she drove home. The next morning, Rachel woke up early. She found Sophie sitting at the kitchen table. Why are you awake? Sophie looked serious. I forgot something. What? I didn't ask Thomas what he wanted for Christmas. Rachel smiled. It's November. So? Rachel laughed. You're planning already? Sophie nodded. I want to give him something. What? I don't know. Rachel sat beside her. Maybe we can ask. Sophie shook her head. No. Why? It has to be a surprise. Rachel smiled. Okay. Sophie decided to make Thomas a Thanksgiving scrapbook. She collected photographs. She drew pictures. She wrote stories. She asked family members to contribute. Rachel added a photograph of Thomas sitting at their Thanksgiving table. Jason added a note. Rachel's mother wrote, Thank you for making our Thanksgiving more meaningful. Even the children contributed. Sophie saved the last page for herself. She wrote, Dear Thomas, I hope you don't feel alone anymore. You can always sit with us. She drew a table. Around it were stick figures. Her mom, her dad, her grandparents, and Thomas. Then she added one more figure. A woman with gray hair, Margaret. Underneath, Sophie wrote, Your wife can sit with us too. When Rachel saw it, she cried. A week later, Rachel took Sophie to visit Thomas. He opened the door. Sophie. She ran into his arms. I made you something. Thomas smiled. What is it? A surprise. She handed him the scrapbook. He opened it. Page after page. Photographs. Drawings. Messages. Memories from Thanksgiving. He turned the pages slowly. Then he reached the last one. He read the words. His hands began to shake. He looked at Sophie. You put Margaret here. Sophie nodded. She should have been at Thanksgiving too. Thomas sat down. He covered his face. Sophie looked worried. Are you sad? Thomas shook his head. No. Then why are you crying? He wiped his eyes. Because sometimes people give you something you didn't know you needed. Sophie hugged him. You can cry. Thomas laughed through his tears. Thank you. Thomas became part of the family. Not immediately, not perfectly, but slowly. He attended Sunday dinners. He helped Jason fix his truck. He taught the children how to change a tire. He showed Sophie how to use a screwdriver. He helped Rachel repair a broken cabinet. He became the person everyone called when something stopped working. One evening, Rachel found him fixing the porch railing. "You don't have to do that." Thomas looked over. "I know." "Then why are you?" He smiled. "Because I can." She sat beside him. "You seem happier." Thomas nodded. "I am." "What changed?" He looked toward the house. "You did." Rachel smiled. "We didn't do anything." "You invited me." "Sophie invited you." Thomas laughed. "Same thing." "No." He shook his head. "It's not." He looked at the house. "I spent almost a year believing nobody wanted me around." Rachel was quiet. Then a little girl looked at me and said, "You can sit with us." He smiled. 6 words. "What?" 6 words changed my life. But Thomas's story wasn't over. One winter morning, he received a phone call. It was David. His son. "Dad?" Thomas froze. He hadn't heard his son's voice in months. "David, how are you?" "I'm okay." There was silence. Then David said, "I'm coming to Ohio." Thomas sat down. "When?" "Next week." "Why?" Another silence. "I need to talk to you." Thomas's heart began pounding. For years he had wanted this. He had imagined his son walking through his door. He had imagined hugging him. But now that it was happening, he was afraid. "What happened?" David sighed. "It's my daughter." "Emma?" "Yes." "What about her?" "She wants to meet you." Thomas closed his eyes. His granddaughter. He hadn't seen her since she was 5. She was now 13. "Of course." David hesitated. "Dad?" "Yes." "I should have come sooner." Thomas didn't answer. "I know." David's voice broke. "I know." Thomas looked toward the window. "Come home." David arrived the following Saturday. Thomas stood outside his apartment. A car pulled up. David stepped out. He looked older, tired. His daughter climbed out after him. She was tall, brown hair, nervous expression. Thomas couldn't move. David walked toward him. "Dad." Thomas nodded. "David?" They stood face to face. Then David hugged him. Thomas held on. Neither spoke. Emma approached. "Grandpa?" Thomas looked at her. His eyes filled with tears. "Emma?" She hugged him. He held her like she was still 5. "I've missed you." She whispered. "I've missed you too." Later, they sat in the apartment. David told Thomas everything. His marriage had almost ended. His career had consumed him. His wife had struggled with depression. He had become overwhelmed. He had avoided his father because every conversation reminded him of how much he had failed. Thomas listened. Then David said, "I thought you were disappointed in me." Thomas shook his head. "I was." David looked down. "I know. But I was more disappointed in myself." "Why?" "Because I thought being a good father meant providing money." Thomas smiled sadly. "I made that mistake too." David looked at him. "I wanted my kids to have everything. What they wanted was you," David cried. Thomas reached across the table. "I understand. I don't deserve forgiveness." Thomas shook his head. "Forgiveness isn't something you earn." "Then what is it?" "Something you choose." David looked at his father. "Do you forgive me?" Thomas smiled. "Yes." David broke down. And for the first time in years, father and son cried together. Thanksgiving came again. This time Thomas didn't go to the park. He didn't sit alone. He didn't bring a paper bag. He arrived at Rachel's house carrying a pumpkin pie. Sophie opened the door. "Thomas!" She hugged him. "You came!" "I promised." Behind him stood David and Emma. Sophie looked surprised. "Who are they?" Thomas smiled. "My family." Sophie grinned. "Then bring them in." David laughed. Rachel welcomed them. The house filled with people. Children. Adults. Grandparents. Neighbors. Friends. Thomas stood in the doorway. For a moment, he remembered the previous Thanksgiving. The bench, the empty chair, the dinner roll, the loneliness. Then he looked around. The house was loud, messy, warm, alive, and he realized something. He had spent so much time mourning the family he had lost that he almost missed the family still waiting for him. Dinner was chaotic. The turkey was slightly dry. Jason burned the rolls. Sophie spilled cranberry sauce on her sweater. Everyone laughed. Thomas sat at the center of the table. He looked around. Then he reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small photograph. Margaret. He placed it beside his plate. Sophie noticed. "Is that your wife?" "Yes. She's sitting with us." Thomas smiled. "Yes." Rachel raised her glass. "To Margaret." Everyone raised theirs. "To Margaret." Thomas looked at the photograph. "I wish she could see this." Sophie reached across the table. "She can." Thomas smiled. "How?" "She can see it through you." Nobody spoke. Thomas looked at Sophie. "You're a wise little girl." She shrugged. "My mom says I'm stubborn." Rachel laughed. "You are." Thomas looked around. Then he said, "I used to think Thanksgiving was about having everyone you loved at the same table." He paused. "But sometimes it's about making room for someone who thinks they have nobody." Rachel smiled. Sophie squeezed his hand. Thomas continued, "I learned that from a little girl." Sophie grinned. "Me?" "Yes." She smiled proudly. After dinner, Thomas stood outside on the porch. David joined him. "You okay?" Thomas nodded. "More than okay." David looked toward the house. "You love them?" "Yes." David smiled. "I'm glad." Thomas looked at him. "I'm glad you're here." David nodded. "Me too." They stood silently. Then David said, "Dad?" "Yes?" "Would you come to California for Christmas?" Thomas looked at him. "You want me there?" David laughed. "Of course." Thomas smiled. "I'd like that." The following Christmas, Thomas flew to California. He met his great-grandchildren. He saw the ocean. He helped David repair a broken kitchen drawer. He made Margaret's pie recipe. It wasn't perfect, but everyone ate it, and nobody complained, because they were together. When Thomas returned to Ohio, he had a new photograph. His entire family stood together. David, Emma, Rachel, Sophie, Jason, everyone. And Thomas? He placed the photograph on his nightstand, next to Margaret. Years passed. Sophie grew up. She became a teacher. Rachel kept the tradition alive. Every Thanksgiving, they invited someone who might otherwise be alone. A widower, a neighbor, a soldier far from home, a single mother, a college student, an elderly couple whose children lived overseas. Sometimes they knew the people. Sometimes they didn't. The rule was simple. If someone had nowhere to go, they had a place at their table. The tradition became known as the extra chair. Every Thanksgiving, Rachel placed one empty chair at the table. Not because they expected someone, but because they wanted to remind themselves that someone might need it. Sophie kept the original scrapbook. Thomas kept the cookie wrapper from that first Thanksgiving. He had saved it. The little chocolate chip cookie Sophie gave him. He had never eaten it. He kept it in a plastic bag. One afternoon, Sophie found it. "You still have this?" Thomas smiled. "Of course. It's 8 years old. I know. It's probably terrible." "Probably. Why didn't you eat it?" Thomas looked at her. "Because it reminded me of the moment someone noticed me." Sophie smiled. "I noticed you." "You did. Why?" Thomas thought about it. "Because you were looking." Thomas eventually became a grandfather figure to Sophie. He attended her graduation. He watched her graduate college. He sat in the front row when she became a teacher. And when Sophie got married, Thomas walked her down the aisle. Rachel cried. David cried. Sophie cried. Thomas cried the hardest. Before the ceremony, Sophie hugged him. "Thank you." "For what?" "For sitting with us." Thomas smiled. "I think you were the one who invited me." "I was. And you changed my life." Sophie shook her head. You changed mine too. Thomas died peacefully at 87. He had his family around him. David was there. Rebecca had flown in from New York. Sophie held his hand. Rachel sat beside the bed. His grandchildren were in the room. On his nightstand was the photograph of Margaret. Beside it was the Thanksgiving scrapbook. Thomas opened his eyes one final time. He looked at Sophie. Is there a table? She smiled through tears. Yes. Is there a chair? Yes. Good. He closed his eyes. And peacefully he was gone. At Thomas's funeral, Sophie stood before everyone. She held the original scrapbook. She opened to the final page. The page she had made when she was 7. The page with the drawing of the Thanksgiving table. The page where she had written, Your wife can sit with us too. Sophie looked at the crowd. When I was 7, I saw a man sitting alone on a bench. She paused. I didn't know he was lonely. I didn't know his wife had died. I didn't know his children lived far away. I didn't know he had spent almost a year believing nobody wanted him. I only knew one thing. She looked at the photograph of Thomas. He was alone. Sophie smiled through tears. So I invited him. She held up the scrapbook. That decision changed my life. She continued. Thomas taught me that loneliness isn't always about being alone. Sometimes you can be surrounded by people and still feel invisible. Sometimes someone doesn't need money. They don't need advice. They don't need you to fix their problems. They just need somewhere to sit. The room was silent. Sophie looked toward her mother, then toward David, then toward the photograph of Thomas. So if you ever see someone sitting alone, don't assume they're okay. Don't assume somebody else will help. Don't assume they want to be left alone. Ask. Listen. Invite them. She smiled. Because you never know what 6 simple words can do. Then she said the words Thomas had carried with him for the rest of his life. You can sit with us. Every Thanksgiving after Thomas died, the family continued the tradition. The extra chair remained. And every year, someone eventually sat in it. One year, it was an elderly woman whose husband had died. Another year, it was a college student whose family lived overseas. Another year, it was a single father who had been working at the grocery store and couldn't afford to travel home. One year, it was a young nurse who had spent Thanksgiving caring for patients. She arrived exhausted. She left laughing. Because there was always room. Years later, Sophie became a mother herself. One Thanksgiving morning, her young daughter asked, Mommy, why is there an empty chair? Sophie smiled. Because someone might need it. Who? I don't know. Then why put it there? Sophie looked at the chair. Because we don't want to wait until we know someone needs us. Her daughter thought about that. Then she asked, Can anyone sit there? Sophie nodded. Anyone. The little girl smiled. Even strangers? Especially strangers. And perhaps that is the real meaning of Thanksgiving. Not the turkey. Not the football. Not the shopping. Not the perfect family photograph. Not the expensive decorations. Not the crowded table. Thanksgiving is about remembering that we have something to give. Sometimes it's food. Sometimes it's money. Sometimes it's a ride. Sometimes it's a phone call. Sometimes it's a chair. And sometimes the most valuable thing we can give another person is the simple assurance that they don't have to sit alone. Thomas had once believed his story was ending. He had lost his wife. He had grown distant from his children. He had sold his home. He had stopped expecting invitations. He had stopped expecting tomorrow. Then a 7-year-old girl looked at him and saw something the adults had missed. She saw a human being. She didn't see an old man. She didn't see a stranger. She didn't see someone else's problem. She saw someone who was alone. And she did what adults often make complicated. She walked over. She smiled. And she said, You can sit with us. Those 6 words didn't bring Margaret back. They didn't erase Thomas's grief. They didn't repair every broken relationship overnight. They didn't magically solve his loneliness. But they gave him something he desperately needed. A beginning. And sometimes that's what kindness really is. Not fixing someone's past. Just giving them a reason to believe they still have a future. So if you ever see someone sitting alone at a restaurant, at a bus stop, in a hospital waiting room, at a park, or even at a crowded Thanksgiving table. Don't look away too quickly. You don't have to know their story. You don't have to know what they're carrying. You don't have to have the perfect words. Just walk over. Ask their name. Ask if they're okay. And if they need somewhere to sit, make room. Because the empty chair beside them may not just be an empty chair. It may be the place where a friendship begins. It may be where someone finds hope. It may be where a family grows. It may be where a lonely heart finally feels seen. And years from now, that person may remember you. Not because you gave them something expensive, not because you solved their problems, but because on a day when the whole world seemed too busy to notice them, you stopped. You looked at them, and you said, "You can sit with us."